Okay, so we are in that portion of the book of Exodus, chapter 1, right? Starting off here, we see that Pharaoh basically tried with the different hardships, and we read about how that he was trying to subdue the children of Israel with heavy tasks and rigorous work. That didn't work. So they just grew more and more. And again, I won't go back much further than that for a review. Here we have the children of Israel in Egypt just growing and growing and becoming more numerous than the Egyptians. And so he comes up with this particular plan, and that is to tell the midwives, who are the Hebrew midwives, to kill every male child. And we're kind of jumping into the context here in verse 19 of Exodus 1. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. So here, again, we're in the middle of the context. The Pharaoh says, why have you not done what I've said? And this is their answer. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. Okay, we're right in the middle of a question, however, about, okay, the midwives, was it acceptable to God? Was it right in God's sight for them to basically deceive Pharaoh? Because even if this was an answer part of the time, the Hebrew women gave birth before they got there, there was more to it than that. And we can see that because of what God says here as far as blessing them. So we ask the question, is it okay sometimes to deceive in extreme circumstances? And I told you before, and I'll tell you now, I don't know the answer, but we went through and looked at a few arguments. We realized that in a number of God's commands, there are some exceptions in extreme situations. Obeying your government. We looked at that particular principle, but there's exceptions for that. We looked at no work on the Sabbath day back in the Old Testament. That was a very strict rule that had extreme punishment if you disobeyed that. But were there any exceptions? There were exceptions. And so also, God hates divorce. We looked at that. The laws about marriage, and God wants marriage to be one man, one woman for life, and let no man separate. But are there any exceptions? There are. There is an exception for that. So we spent some time looking at that, and we also read some passages that very clearly show that God hates lying. He hates deception. We looked at Proverbs 6 and Proverbs 12 and Proverbs 19 and looked and see that's the principle there. Do not lie. God hates lies. And he who speaks lies will not escape. Proverbs 19 verse 5. Is there ever an exception? Well, we looked at two examples for that last week. Just really quickly, 2 Samuel 17 verse 14. 2 Samuel 17 is a case of where Absalom has taken over the kingdom. David has to flee, and David sends back his counselor that deceives Absalom into making a decision to wait and not pursue him until he has amassed his forces. And because he did that, because he waited, then he was defeated, and actually Absalom was killed. And we read here in the context here also, let's just read this one. So Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai, that was the man that David sent in, the Archite, is better than the advice of Ahithophel, even though it was a deception. For the Lord purposed to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel to the intent that the Lord might bring disaster on Absalom. Looks like there's an exception here about in extreme situations, in wartime, it's okay to deceive the enemy. Maybe. Here, again, we won't go into our discussion on that like we did last week. Another example here was when, let's see here, what are we looking at? Gideon defeats the numerous nation of the Midianites, but he does this with a force of 300, even though the Midianites were like numerous as the sand of the sea, and they did it by deceiving the camp of the Midianites into thinking there was a great force when there was only 300 of them. Okay. And then we came down to this last example of why it's maybe possible to deceive your enemy or a terrible tyrant in order to save lives. And this is the example of Rahab the harlot. I'm going to read through this pretty quickly, and then we'll get to our kind of conclusion on this. And now we are in a sidebar here. We're kind of just looking at this question to see if it's something that applies to us today. Joshua 2, verse 1 through 5. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and came to the house of the harlot named Rahab and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country." So the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house." Then the woman took the 2 men and hid them. That's a deception there, right? Took 2 men and hid them. So she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from." Now we see in just a few verses, well, she did know where they were from. In fact, that's why she hid them. And it happened as the gate was being shut, when it was dark, that the men went out. Well, that's not true. Where are they now when she says this? They're hiding up on the roof, right? Okay, so she's deceived the king of Jericho into thinking that the men were there, but now they're gone, when they actually were not. Okay, looking on to the next verse 6, where the men went, I do not know. That's not right. She knows exactly where they are. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. Now that seems, this isn't last minute. This is something she schemed at. She said, "I'm going to lay these, stalks of stalks of flax like wheat, long bundles of wheat. You can, lay them out to dry." And they were up on the roof. I can just see them laying out row after row and leaving a pocket for somebody to hide there, more row, and leaving in a pocket there, and then covering it all up. So this was done very purposefully. Then the men pursued them by the road to the Jordan, to the fords. As soon as those who pursued them had gone out, they shut the gate. Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us. And all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt." Now this is going to happen later in the context of our study, so back in chapter 1. But this again is an account of Rahab and the city of Jericho. And what you did to the kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. Okay, last part here this is where we kind of finished up last week with the explanation of what's going on here. "And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is the God in heaven above and on the earth beneath." What an amazing statement by somebody who wasn't an Israelite, but because of the evidence she saw, she said, Jehovah is God. The God of Israelites is the God of heaven and a God on earth. And we'll see that her faith is commended in this example. "Now, therefore, I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house and give me a true token." Okay, I'm going to finish with that. We read through that context there before and ask the question, okay, what does the Lord think of what Rahab did? Well, we look over in the New Testament. We'll look at 2 passages here, at least, and see if we can figure out. I don't know if we're going to come to the answer we're looking for, but we certainly can figure some things out. Over in Hebrews verse 11, or chapter 11, here's the Hall of Fame of faith, people of faith, a list of people who were commended because of their faith. And we see in verse 31, "By faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, when she had received the spies with peace." So she's commended very specifically, along with the list of other men and women who by faith did what pleased God. Okay, does that mean the deception pleased him? Maybe. We don't know for sure. We can't tell. But again, we ask the question, how else could she have hidden the spies? What else could she have done? Even hiding them is a deception. So that's kind of our question we're trying to figure out. And then in James 2, another passage in the New Testament that talks about Rahab. In the context of faithful Abraham, let's begin in verse 23. And the scripture was fulfilled, which said, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. That's another story, but if you've been here for Genesis, you know what that's all about. And he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. Okay, likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? So again, this is all positive affirmation and praise by the writer of the book of James concerning what Rahab did. So we see in the first passage, by faith, she pleased God. And in this passage in James, not only by faith, but by her works, she was acceptable to God. Now, it would be crystal clear if it would say in this passage down here at the bottom, Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and deceived the king of Jericho and sent them out another way, then we would know for sure that deception in extreme situations like this, if you're saving lives that are innocent, is acceptable. What do you think? One other example, and then I'll ask what you think. And this is a little bit later in our context in Exodus when Moses is born. And what does his mother do? In verse 23 of this is Hebrews 11 talking about Moses, who's another person of faith, and so was his mother. So by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. So here we have again, here's this deception. She wasn't open, Moses' mother, about here's my baby, come and kill him. No, she hid him for that long of a time so that he wouldn't be killed, just like Rahab hid the spies. So what do you think? Is there ever an extreme situation? Don's got a comment. Mike or Gary?
Is that necessary?
No, I don't think it's necessary inference.
Because it says that in James anyway, that the Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way. So it's necessary inference that the deception that was involved with that was part of the justification, right?
It seems like that, I think. That's the argument made. I don't know if I can be 100% sure. Are you pretty clear on that one? That in that particular situation, and of course as we look here back with the midwives, they're trying to save these little babies' lives. Come on. It would be the argument you could use, is that in that particular situation, is God, does he accept the deception that's involved to save innocent lives?
All I can say is, like it says in Romans 8:28 about God using every situation to turn out for good to those who love God. And so this obviously turned out the way God intended it for it to turn out by whatever means it came about.
So you can't necessarily for sure say he's condoning the lie, even from Rahab, but the rest of her actions. I mean, she was a harlot, let's just say. I mean, there's no mention about that being right or wrong. Of course, she was a harlot in a nation of a heathen nation. So nothing is mentioned about that practice. And I'm assuming when she becomes a proselyte, which basically she must, because now she's going to obey this God, that she's going to change her occupation. Okay, yeah, so there you go. So she changes her life. But anyway, was the act of deception acceptable? And you got Mike up here. Mike.
So,
I'm sorry, this Mike over here. Too many mics.
You know what? I defer to my brother Michael Franklin first.
Oh, okay,
Maybe he'll
Franklin.
say what I was going to say, and I can pretend like I can deceive you and make you think that what I was going to say.
Franklin.
in Paul's second epistle to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, he talks about somebody and I'm not saying that God just justifies this, but there is an insight here I think we should take into consideration. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, beginning of verse 9, he warns, he says, the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception, he says, for those who are perishing because they refused to love the truth.
Okay.
So, who are these who refuse to love the truth? Well, obviously, and ultimately, they are the enemies of God. And this deception, again, as Don was, I think, indicating, part of God's overall plan and working. And I'm not saying that God justifies or authorizes this one who's deceiving in this case, but I think it's even God recognizes that with those who oppose him, the truth is not going to make any difference. And so deception may, I'm not, and again, for somebody to set out and say, this person is opposed to God, so I'm going to go lie to him. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we have to look at these things from a higher perspective and understand that certainly what would we do? We would either, in some cases, like somebody comes up and they're persecuting Christians, and this is the fact in many nations. And somebody comes to you, a believer, and says, "Is Andrew a Christian?"
And if I answer yes, he might be put to death or something, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet, if you said no, what are you saying about him and his faith?
Right.
And so,
I think that's clear. We would all say yes. We couldn't hide that, and that's in a pretty extreme situation. Okay, good answer.
would we all say yes?
Oh, I don't know. Would we?
I mean, that's the
Can we take
question
a
I'm
poll?
asking.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
do
think
I
we
want to
should.
condemn my brother by acknowledging it? Yeah. Or, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not under that situation, but it would be a strong temptation.
Yeah. Okay. Mike.
So challenging, Bill, and I'm impressed that you've thought this through a lot and have a lot of arguments. There's still some that, for instance, Rahab was hiding them deception. Moses was hiding him. That's kind of a tough call. I'm not sure that hiding is the same thing. It's maybe it is, but we have Daniel, who's praised because he doesn't close it. All he had to do is close his windows.
All he had to do was close the windows.
That was
Yeah.
extreme. And would that have been deception if he would have closed his windows? I mean, I'd say no. That they probably would guess what he's doing, but the apostles, we told you not to preach in that name.
Right.
And they could say, "Oh, wow, it really slipped our mind. Can you give us another chance?" But we have several extreme situations in the Bible where they're clearly praised or approved by God, where they didn't deceive. And so, I love your question, and it's a great one for us to really chew on.
You come to this class not to get any answers. You come to get the questions.
I
then
just
you got to
feel
chew
like-
on them and see what the answer.
I feel like the last thing I'll say is this. 'Cause as I mentioned to you before you ever brought this up, I've been planning at least a couple lessons on, is it ever okay to lie? And they're not done, and I'm not going to do them soon. But there are just a lot of things that come to mind. I've just lost my point. So thank you for that. And we'll continue to...
Yeah, no, I look forward to that lesson. Again, we don't have to, especially in something like this, it's this difficult to figure out exactly in extreme situations. We're patient with each other, obviously, about what, let's see, I think Bill was first, then Joe up here afterwards. Gary?
In Matthew 9, Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees say, doesn't he know what he's doing? And Jesus knew their thoughts. And he said, I want you to go and learn that compassion trumps sacrifice.
Yeah.
And what these ladies were doing, what these midwives were doing, was practicing compassion. Now that's long before, Hosea wrote it in Hosea 6:6, but they were practicing compassion. And you know that it had to be right because God blessed them.
Yeah. So yeah, and we brought that verse up last week, if you remember, in that context that we looked at. And so that may be a principle that would apply here. But I appreciate what Mike said, I think last week when you said that God could have carried out this deliverance in either case without somebody lying. I know he could have. So that's why I say, and obviously they did deceive, and that's the way it worked out, and God blessed them for their faith and their works. But God can do things any way he chooses. And Joe over here had her, you guys still have your hand up, Joe? Oh, no, Joe, sorry, Joe. Sister Carol.
Well, one thing I'm noticing in each of these cases you bring on lying is, God knows what's in our heart.
Mm-hmm.
And these people weren't lying for greed. They
No,
weren't
it was
lying
not-
for
yeah, right.
power. They weren't, lying. And even here in a couple chapters, we get into Moses commits murder.
Mm-hmm.
And yet nothing's said evil about it or done, or, but he did it to protect somebody else.
Yeah.
So in all these cases, and like Mike brings up the persecution, it's done for protection. And we look at history, how many Jews were saved during the Holocaust by Christians who were deceptive?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
had to be.
so it seems like, there's an exception to every rule. Like on the Sabbath, there's an exception to every rule. And in these cases, they were not done for power or greed or,
Right.
Anything, covetousness, anything like that. They were done to save lives and to try to bring about God's way.
Yeah, which may not justify the lie, but that, yes, they were trying to do what was right. And if they didn't, if they failed in this one point where they lied and they shouldn't have, still, it's like when we're trying to live as faithful Christians and we're going along trying to do what we can doing, and we make a mistake. We did something that we shouldn't have. We shouldn't have said what we said. God still so much appreciates the faith and works we're giving him. We don't have to do it perfectly. So if these guys erred, these ladies in specific erred in both Rahab and these midwives erred in that point, still their overall work was very acceptable to God. It's clear and plain to see. And that's the important lesson, I think, is that when we go along trusting God, trying to do what's right, and maybe we make a decision that we shouldn't make, and we add that with it, God is very forbearing and patient with us in that area. So again, I haven't come up with an answer here. We have somebody, okay, what do you got, Mike? The third Mike today.
One of the things I think that we do is we take the word lying and we give it such a narrow definition. You look at the word afraid in 11:23. Now, I'm sure his parents were concerned about what would happen, but afraid in that situation means they weren't afraid enough that they were going to give him up. Mm-hmm. And so most words are defined based on how they're used in the sentence, and you have to kind of figure it out. And I think, but when it comes to lying, for some reason, we lock it down to it can only mean any deception.
Any deception at all,
and
yeah.
so I think
You may be right about
I
that.
think that's part of the problem is we got to lock down such a tight definition, and it should be defined based on how it's used in the context.
Okay, good argument. Boy, with Rahab especially, it seems so clear to me that it was acceptable, even the lie. But again, I can't be 100% sure. My mind works in weird ways. I mean, it's the same thing. Mike's not convinced. I'm not convinced either. But if I was there at the time, I might have done the same thing. I might have. So, Lee, what do you think?
We can find these exceptions in the Bible where there's instances where somebody had a need to deceive. But we don't find any place where anybody is approved of who makes a practice of deceiving everything all the time.
No, that's for
It's
sure
got
very
to
clear.
be something that happens only on rare and very special occasions,
Yeah.
and with trepidation even there.
Okay, good answer. And with that, any more comments? Joel, go ahead. Good point, Lee.
Oh, it's interesting. I was teaching the high school class several years ago, and this sort of thing came up, and I like to reference books like Keep It Simple, Stupid, whatever that stuff is. And so
Yeah.
I got a book on Christianity, right? And so the people that wrote that book, they were absolutely certain there were 2 occasions which it was okay to lie. One was in extreme situations like we're talking about, but the other one was if you were trying not to hurt someone's feelings. And I think, I told the kids, I was like, there's an argument for the first thing if there's an extreme situation, and we talked about some of these examples, but I told him, I said, I don't see anywhere in Scripture that it indicates that it's okay to lie to not hurt someone's feelings, because, man, that opens up a whole can of worms.
That's the problem. We don't want to open up any cans of worms here and think that every situation we're in, or half of them, or a quarter of them, are exceptional situations.
Right. I think the bottom line is that these people feared God, and that motivated them.
Yeah.
Instead of fearing their government or what have you. And so when you start saying it's okay to lie to not hurt someone's feelings, well, is that more for your benefit or for their benefit? And there's a lot of questions that come up in that regards.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Anybody else? I don't want to shut it down until we're done talking about it, but I don't want to carry it on too long. We did do this as sort of a side thing, very much a side thing. It just is something that's always I've wondered about. And unfortunately, I'm still wondering about it. So, but I think it was useful to go through some of these scriptures and talk about it. Mike.
Of course, today, all these midwives would have to say is we couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl.
Oh,
So we let it live.
Mike, you're crazy. No, you're good. Thanks for that ending thought there, Michael. We're going to move on. Okay, so we have these midwives here, and we just read this context. We're coming back to Exodus 1, verse 19 through 22. And they're not going to kill these babies. All right? So now what does Pharaoh do? Verse 22, the last verse on this slide here. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So even though we've rescued these babies with the Hebrew midwives' help, Pharaoh goes around that. And so they're still under this extreme persecution, and brings us to chapter 2, where Moses is born. Okay. These same women delivered Moses. That's them right there. Okay, anyway. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And we don't get the names here of the man and the woman, but we do later on in Exodus 6 and verse 20, where we have this Levite Amram married his father's sister Jochebed, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. So there's mom and dad. Interesting that she marries apparently her aunt here, but that's the way it is. And this is when Moses is born. That's who the parents are. And we don't have a lot more said about Amram and Jochebed, so other than what's in this context here. So she conceived and bore a son, verse 2, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. I guess if he had looked like me when I was a baby, what do you think about that? Beautiful child. Say what? Turn him in. You know, beautiful in some places is translated goodly. You know, so healthy child, sweet, whatever. It may have been part of the motive to hide him. I can't imagine any mother would just say, oh, boy, he looks terrible. We'll turn him over and keep the good ones. But that's what it says, beautiful child. I don't know exactly why that
English Standard reads fine child.
Fine, okay. And may have been some motivation later here when Pharaoh's daughter sees him in the basket here. Might have been, who knows? So, verse 3. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch. Asphalt, you mean like the stuff on the street out there? Not exactly. Bituminous tar material. And there were tar pits you could locate in a number of the areas around Palestine and Egypt and so on, that they could get some kind of tar, and then pitch, obviously from a tree, very likely. Put the child in it and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Now we see God's hand in all of this, obviously. He's got a plan. We know what that plan is. If you've read it already, we know what's going on. Verse 5, then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Compassion. So obviously doesn't have the same mindset as her dad, right? Who was wanting to kill every Hebrew child. She has some compassion here. I think most of the women probably wouldn't have been in agreement with Pharaoh's command. Don't know about the guys, but likely not the women, because they have this compassion for little infants and children. And so do men, but I'm just saying that that's something that women especially have. Okay, moving on. So she sees that in verse 7. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women? And that she may nurse the child for you. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So, wow, it turned out better than it did to begin with. Not only does she have her child, at least for a time, but now she's getting paid to take care of him. Interesting how that worked out there. So she goes off with Jochebed, and she takes care of him. In verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. Okay, how long did this take? It's really not clear. It could have been 2 years to 5 years. Some people nurse their children to 5 years. If you ever known about the La Leche League that's present today, oftentimes children are nursed till they're 5 years old. That may seem kind of strange to you, but that's what is often done in some societies. So somewhere between 2 and 5 years, perhaps. And he became her son, so she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. So Moses, the definition of that name, word is to draw out. And so that's how he got his name. Okay, let me just make sure I'm close to where I want to be here in my notes. And the next verse, verse 11, now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. Okay, now this is 40 years later. This is 40 years after Pharaoh's daughter took him up out of that basket. In fact, we find that out, and we'll read a passage in a bit that says it's 40 years later. You divide, it's kind of nice, you can divide Moses' life up, his 120 years life up into 3 parts. There's the 40 years up to this point, and then he's going to be going away here to Midian for 40 years when he leaves Egypt, and then he's going to come back when God sends him back and deliver them and go with them in the wilderness for another 40 years. And that's 120 years old. And when God does take his life, he's still it says he's still vigorous. So, but that's a different story there. Excuse me a minute, I'm kicking stuff underneath the table. All right, we don't want to disconnect everything there. Okay. So he sees his brethren, and looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? Then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So this isn't turning out at all the way Moses figured it was going to. In fact, we'll read a passage in a minute that he thought something different was going to happen. Let's keep going on here for a bit, and we'll make some comments about, well, let's see. Hold on a minute. I want to go there yet. Kill the Egyptian. Yeah, let's go ahead. We'll see how this whole affair is repeated in the New Testament in a few places. And it's good to get a little more information when we go there. So Moses now has killed the Egyptian who was afflicting the Hebrew, and he now also was trying to separate his own brethren from each other, and they didn't appreciate it. Over in Acts chapter 7, verse 17, here's Stephen's defense to the Sanhedrin when he is about to be stoned, but he gives this defense, and he includes an account of what's going on here. He says in verse 17, but when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt. This is all the stuff we've been reading about. Till another king who arose did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our fathers, making them expose their babies that they may not live. Going on, verse 18, verse 20, let me see here, verse 20 rather. At this time Moses was born and was well pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up and set her own son. Okay, that we all know, set up as her own son. Okay, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So here's what we haven't heard yet. During this 40 years, he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. So he became a very competent person in the wisdom of the Egyptians. And he had, I mean, if you look at the old movie, the 10 Commandments, you see Moses building pyramids and things. Well, I don't know if that happened, but he was mighty in words and deeds. They're not in the Bible. We don't know what deeds he was doing, but because, I mean, here he is, basically, Pharaoh's son, and he's doing all these things and becoming accomplished, very accomplished there as an Egyptian, somebody who was living with the Egyptians. Now notice here something that comes up here. It says he's mighty in words and deeds. Now a little bit later, we're going to see in the context when Moses is talking to God, he actually says in Exodus 4 verse 10, a little bit later, then Moses said to the Lord, this is when God is asking him to go out and to speak to the children of Israel. And he gives an excuse and he says, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. So which is it? Was he mighty in words, or was he slow in speech and slow? Can you be mighty in words and still be slow of speech and slow of tongue? I think you can. I think it could be talking about two different things. That he wasn't a good orator. He didn't explain, I mean, just wasn't, but he had the wisdom, and the words he did share with people, even maybe though he wasn't very good at doing it, were mighty and were wise and were, received well. That to me is one example, it could be, of what some people say is an apparent contradiction. I don't think it has to be a contradiction at all. Okay, this is the point. Point there that he became very learned and very accomplished when he was in the land of Egypt. Okay, moving on to the next verse. We're still in Acts, and Stephen is giving this argument to the Jews about their fathers and what they were like. And he says, now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. Okay, So here's Moses going out. Don't know what his plan was at this time. Maybe he thought he could go out and every day kill one Egyptian. And maybe, maybe there was 450, slave or people who were the masters over the slaves. And in a year and a half, he'd have them all dead. I mean, what was his plan? You don't know. But he thought that they would understand that this is something God wanted him to do. Now this bears the question to be asked, did God send Moses out to do this right now? Or was this murder, like Joe just said a little bit ago, he murdered this guy? I mean, his intentions were good. Now, we don't want to go down that road. If we talked about lies in extreme situations. Would this be okay to murder somebody? Well, sometimes it is okay to kill somebody, but this is not, I don't think, one of them. Maybe it is. I don't know for sure. But nothing comes of this other than Moses having to flee town, get out of town. And then it wasn't until 40 years later that God brings him back. So in Moses' mind anyway, he had already understood that he's God's child. He wants to help the people of Israel, and this is how he starts out doing it. Mike.
Well, the Holy Spirit through Stephen, as he was giving testimony in front of the Jews, said that he saw somebody suffering wrong and he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. I think we have to be careful about trying to inject, our standard of criminal justice and evidence and
maybe justifiable here then, okay?
That's what the scripture seems to,
okay.
That I've always read it and what it's telling me.
And you look at we're going to go to Hebrews 11 in just a second too, that says everything positive about what Moses is doing here. Of course, it didn't work out the way Moses wanted. No. I mean, here this guy told on him and said, he basically let it known, and we're going to see Pharaoh finds out, and then he's chased out of town.
And the way things work out doesn't justify or exonerate. I mean, it doesn't necessarily reflect on whether God accepted it or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't know what God's plan was here. Moses' plan was, hey, I'm going to start delivering my people. And that doesn't get fulfilled till later. And we're going to see later on, too, that Moses is a different person in some way, in a number of ways. But Gary, go ahead. What do you got? Or Mike?
There's obviously something that we're not privy to, because we don't have any record of God speaking to Moses yet.
No.
But Moses already understands that God's going to use him somehow.
Yeah.
So there's parts in there that we just don't know.
We don't know. So we don't know. Basically
that sometimes we whittle on God's end of the stick.
That's right. And we're just trying to find an answer if there is one. If there's not, we're just going to say, okay, that's God's business. So you got Andy, got a point?
And I guess maybe I'm jumping ahead a couple verses, but this has always perplexed me because I get the impression that Moses is basically like a prince. Mm-hmm. And my understanding is the pharaohs were pretty much above the law. They could do what they wanted. And this guy who Moses killed wasn't anybody necessarily important in the grand scheme of Egypt. Mm-hmm. So if Pharaoh had killed this guy, nobody would have batted an eye. Nobody would have cared.
Nobody wouldn't think so.
And yet here's this prince who was a man of mighty deeds and works it seems like Moses is a pretty important guy, and yet he's fearing because he killed this. I've just never really understood it, and maybe it's just my misunderstanding of Egyptian culture.
It is a fair question, because he's Pharaoh's son, basically, but maybe he was treated as a Pharaoh's son who was a Hebrew. I don't know. Exceptional situation that Pharaoh allowed to live, because, if his daughter knew who knows the situation? We just don't know. So we do know how it turned out. It didn't turn out well. The next passage we read here, which we'll wait till next week, is going to be that Pharaoh finds out and he's got to leave. And he leaves for 40 years. He's gone a long time before God appears to him and tells him to go back and rescue.
And it doesn't indicate that he left as a prince with a cartload of wealth.
No, in fact, the next passage we'll read in Hebrews 11 says he forsook all of that to be persecuted, and which is an amazing passage for us. Hebrews 11, verse 24, some beautiful stuff in there about what's going on right now. And then we'll get back into the context. So, well, our time is up. Any more comments before we finish up? Appreciate your presence here and your participation, and we'll meet back here to worship in about 10 minutes. Thank you.